I want to talk about how the tide might be turning on mass immigration, but let's get to grips first with the basics. So what is the immigration rate in the UK? What's going wrong?
So I think the UK basically is going through an extreme experiment that is being led by politicians on both the left and the right, both Labour and the Tories, who over the last 20 years have basically opened the floodgates, have imposed on the British people a policy that very few people in this country actually support, and which is now making Britain poorer. I think the evidence now shows that, more divided, less prosperous. And I think unless we get our arms around this problem and stop it and address it and end the period of mass uncontrolled immigration, we're going to have enormous problems.
So I think I asked you this last time and I still can't get my head around it. For whose benefit is this rapid mass immigration?
Yeah, so firstly, I mean, the scale of the changes we need to think about. I mean, over the last couple of years, we've had 2.5 million people migrate into the UK. That's equivalent to about two cities the size of Birmingham in 2 years. We've got much of that migration now, thanks to Boris Johnson and the Tories, is coming from outside of Europe. So about 86% of all migration into Britain is now coming from outside of Europe, from Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Pakistan. And a lot of folks in Westminster will say, well, this is good for the economy, but actually only about 16 to 18% of people who are coming into Britain now, 16 to 18% are coming in on high-skilled worker visas. So you think, well, who the hell's coming in? Who else is coming in? Students, the relatives of workers, asylum seekers, illegal migrants. So what basically is happening is mass migration is pushing all of us into managed decline. It's costing us economically. I've shared this information widely on Substack, but even the Office for Budget Responsibility now accepts, which is a kind of, woke government department, now accepts that mass immigration is making us poorer. So for every low-wage, low-skill migrant coming into Britain, it's costing the taxpayers watching this show between £150,000 and £1 million over their lifetime. So what I'm trying to say, to be clear, if you're watching this from Britain or you're watching this from Europe, wondering what the hell's going on in Britain, basically you've been lied to by left and right, and you've been lied to by Boris Johnson and the Tories, and you're now being gaslit by Keir Starmer and the Labour government, because we don't have a high-skill migration policy. We have mass, uncontrolled, unprecedented, low-wage, low-skill migration, which is making us poorer and is culturally incompatible. I would argue we are importing masses of people from radically different cultures, from radically different societies. And what that is doing, as serious scholars like Robert Putnam at Harvard and others have shown, rapid demographic change on the scale that we have in Britain is pushing us into a low-trust society, a divided society, where people hunker down and they turn away from their neighbours because they don't know their neighbours anymore. And that's basically what's happening in Britain. Nobody in Westminster really wants to face up to this reality, except to some people outside of the big two parties that we'll come back to. But this is being imposed on everybody because it benefits big business. Let's be clear about who's benefiting. It benefits global corporations who want masses of cheap labour because it keeps their costs low and their profits high. It's also benefiting the kind of radically progressive, woke, new elite in London, Oxford, and Cambridge, because they want to feel good about themselves. They want to have that sense of virtue, that sense of moral righteousness, and they won't live with the negative effects of this policy because they tend to live in neighbourhoods that are not affected by it. So those are the big beneficiaries. Everybody else, outside of big business and let's say the 15% elite minority, everybody else suffers. Everybody else pays the costs of mass uncontrolled immigration, both economic and cultural, and everybody else has to deal with disproportionate rates of crime among illegal migrants and new arrivals. They have to deal with weaker social cohesion, with the breakdown of our social fabric. They have to deal with issues like the grooming gang scandal across much of northern England and many other areas. And they have to deal with the growing signs of segregation and sectarianism in our society. So this policy isn't working. That, by the way, we'll get onto this, I'm sure, but that is why British politics now is in the most unpredictable, chaotic, volatile moment that it's ever been on record. And that is why we've not only just gone from a massive Conservative majority to a massive Labour majority in 5 years, but that is why anything is possible in 2029.
Wow. I mean, 20 years ago, there were very few centrists or moderates who were radically anti-immigration or concerned about immigration, or outspokenly against immigration. When did that? Was there a certain moment that changed that? What happened for you? What made you go, hang on a minute? I mean, did you used to think it might, or maybe it's racist, or like a lot of us did?
So I understand why people think conversations like the one that we're having is somehow problematic or provocative, or that the things I say they might construe as being racist, because that word is meaningless now. What's happened is the elite class has expanded that word to mean basically any views around migration that they disagree with are now considered racist or xenophobic. I come at this from the point of view of evidence in terms of what we can see is actually happening. I also come at this from the point of view of what I believe makes a cohesive, sustainable national community, which is a shared set of values, shared sense of history or collective memory, shared sense of identity. And a bit like a garden, you want to have that nation protected by strong borders so that people within that nation feel safe and secure. I don't think mass uncontrolled immigration serves any of those things. I think it undermines the very essence of what a national community is. It undermines a shared sense of identity. It undermines a shared sense of history because people don't have the same history. It undermines a shared sense of culture because we're importing people from radically different, and I would argue in some cases, inferior cultures that have not produced the kinds of things that Western civilization and Western culture has produced over recent centuries. And I think now the evidence from the Netherlands to Denmark to Britain is that this is also making us poorer and less prosperous. So why should we stand for it? Why should we not challenge it and critique it? That doesn't make you a racist for pointing that out. That makes you somebody who is concerned about your nation and what comes at this from the point of view of evidence. If you go back 20 years with, say, New Labour and Tony Blair, many people then were deeply uncomfortable about the arrival of mass immigration as a policy. It began in 2004, really, when Tony Blair opened up the doors. That saw net migration, the number of people coming in minus the number of people leaving, that saw net migration reach around 200,000, which at the time was considered to be a really big number. If you look at where we are today, net migration recently just hit almost 1 million, which, is unprecedented. We've had more migration over the last 5 years than we've had really over the last 1,000, if you add it all up. And this is only going to accelerate. This is what a lot of people watching this show don't yet know, right? They haven't yet realized. If you look ahead at what the government's planning with its forecasts, so, we've just had 2.5 million people migrate into Britain over the last couple of years. We've had about 4 million since the COVID pandemic, most of those low-skilled, low-wage workers. Now look at where we're going. By the year 2036, according to the government's own forecasts, we're going to have another 6.5 million people being added to Britain's population, which is about 6 cities the size of Birmingham.
Or entire countries. It's 6.5 million people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's basically the best part of another London in just about a decade. At the same time, as immigration is now the only driver of our population growth, because our fertility rate has collapsed, our birth rate has collapsed, it's now at 1.4. The replacement level is 2.1, and it's forecast to drop to 1.3 by the end of this century. So immigration, what I'm saying is it's not only changing the country you see today, but basically over the next decade, the scale and speed of change that is going to come through British society as a result of migration from mainly outside of European nations is going to be something on the scale that nobody in this country has ever seen before. So what you're seeing now is just the start of an immigration explosion. Now, the questions that raises around what does it mean for housing? What does it mean for infrastructure? What does it mean for economic growth? We don't have any economic growth currently. What does it mean for social cohesion? What does it mean for our shared sense of identity, history, and values? Nobody in Westminster is seriously talking about those questions. In fact, the only debates that are happening, Andrew, are the debates on podcasts like this one because even the BBC and others are terrified of really having long-form discussions about this issue because they don't want to get into it because it is so seismic when you actually look at the numbers involved.
Yeah, do you remember? I often think about this, that Stacey Dooley documentary about 13 years ago on the BBC, where she was worried about what was happening to Luton. You couldn't make, presumably in those last 13, 14 years, it's 10 times that in terms of new people coming to this country. That was about Islam, that documentary. And now you wouldn't even be able to make that document. The BBC, can you imagine them making that documentary today?
Well, if you look at where we're going in terms of, say, Muslim migration in Britain, or the evolving or the growth of the existing Muslim population in the country, if you take a pretty centrist, I would even say quite liberal think tank like the Pew Research Centre, they have shown that between today and 2050, Britain is forecast to see the largest absolute increase in the number of Muslims of all European nations between today and 2050. So we're going to go from, I think, a share of our population, which is Muslim, of around 6%. We're going to go up to somewhere around 15%. Sweden is going to go to about 35%, France to about 31%, Germany as well. So the demographic trend in Europe, the trends that are going to radically transform European societies unless we change course. And we can change course because this is a conscious policy that's being pursued by political elites. We could make a different choice if we wanted. But unless we change course, this is going to be the biggest demographic and cultural transformation Europe's ever seen.